Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mike Nierenberg. I'm a partner with the firm of Bora Goldstein. We are a full-service real estate law firm focused on all aspects of real estate. My practice focused mainly on transactional real estate, sales, acquisitions, leasing, co-op and condo board representation. And most of our clients are in the area of owners, developers, commercial tenants, and property managers. So I'm joined by two titans in the industry. Andrew Dansker, principal of Dansker Capital Group. Andrew's firm lends on a large-scale commercial industrial development projects, deep pool of capital resources, and an in-house processing team able to handle the most complex transaction. I'm also joined by my partner, Jeffrey Seiden, who has been a real estate litigator for 15 years, representing big and small landlords and management companies throughout the city and the surrounding areas. Jeff counsels clients in all aspects of daily management of their properties and is the go-to resource for owners navigating the ever-changing rent laws of New York, which may have changed again today for all we know. Both men have been published and are quoted in most of the real estate industry publications. So today we're going to talk about what is going on in real estate in this environment. So, while 2020 has been a year many of us in real estate would like to forget, it's useful for us to understand that a lot of this happened prior to COVID. A lot of the groundwork was laid prior to COVID. It's just been more noticeable because of the economic downturn because of COVID. In the last 4 years, we've seen retail space in prime areas of Manhattan and Brooklyn go into widespread disuse as owners remain steadfast in maintaining empty storefronts rather than reducing rent or taking action against existing tenants. Even in the pre-pandemic era of heavy foot traffic and distant tourism, retail business was in serious decline due to growing online presence of businesses. And there used to be an acceptable cost of doing business, a loss-leading unit in Manhattan, and that's not exactly what people want to do anymore. And now adding Hudson Yards with a massive retail influx of retail and office, there's a potential for crisis in the market. So a lot of what I've been doing on the transactional side in the last few months is renegotiating terms of retail, office, and residential leases. Also renegotiating sales and acquisitions of contracts of mixed-use, multifamily, industrial properties. We've seen a lot of retrading of contracts, meaning that contracts that have already been signed pre-pandemic are now being retraded. Terms are being changed, and that's getting the deal done. Same with leases. Existing leases, terms are changing. So from conversations I've had with colleagues, I'm going to bring in Jeff and Andrew in a moment. It's a belief that we're not going to get out of this for some period of time. The winter's going to be tough. There might be a second wave, but we will get out of it. Maybe next summer, maybe in the spring, maybe when there's a vaccine. But I think there's a lot of open-ended questions about where we are, or how, if this is the bottom, or we're going to go further down. I think both men have certain opinions on that one. And we'll see what laws change as well. A big issue with office and retail leasing, especially retail, has been the guarantor protection clause of local law 1932A, allowing guarantors to have escape personal liability on leases effectively from March 7th of this year now through March 31st of next year. Lease terms are going to change. The force majeure is going to become a much bigger thing, and then force majeure clause is going to change to include government restrictions and pandemic, where in fact they were not previously. So with that in mind, I have two great people here, both come from different areas. As I mentioned, Jeff is a landlord-tenant litigator. Andrew is a lender and on a lot of large projects in the city, and they both men have their ear to the ground on what's going on. So I'm going to start with Jeff here. And I'm going to give you an open-ended question. What's going on with evictions? I hear it every day. What is going on with evictions? And what are landlords supposed to do when they go to you and they say, Jeff, I have a tenant, I need to evict him. What am I supposed to do?
So I guess the question is what's going on with evictions or not going on with evictions right now. So you sort of touched on some of the commercial side of things where you have the local law that suspended commercial guarantees liability. Right now with commercial, it's a little bit more straightforward than with residential. So commercial, they've sort of there's an executive order that's in effect that basically prevents the landlord from initiating a non-payment case in housing court against a tenant who faced financial hardship as a result of the pandemic. So while we've been serving rent demands, with the hope that this would be lifted, but also to try to open a dialogue with some of the commercial tenants that are really just are being unresponsive or unreasonable with their landlord and trying to get, come to some sort of accord to pay some money to try to get through this, to keep their businesses open. But right now, we've had to look at alternative ways of trying to enforce non-payment of rent, such as drawing down on security deposits if the lease provides for it, and that usually creates an event of default, which allows us to get around that executive order to put it in court, because that would be a holdover proceeding and not necessarily a non-payment proceeding. Also, another avenue is to go to Supreme Court with the non-paying tenant, but also, there's certain economic factors of the cost of going there, and that typically is a slower process, although right now the courts have been grinded to a very slow crawl in handling the cases that are already in court. The residential side is a little bit more complicated because the legislature passed something called the Tenant Safe Harbor Act. So basically what that means is that if a tenant had rent that accrued from March 7th, and this was recently extended to January 1st of 2021, the landlord would not be entitled to evict that tenant from the apartment for non-payment of rent. The only relief that you can get would be a money judgment against the tenant, which you can eventually collect on it through, garnishing their wages or going after their assets or stuff like that. So that created a defense in court. So it does not prevent the landlord from actually commencing the case against the tenant. And what we've been doing sort of during the pandemic here is dealing with a lot of the pre-COVID cases where the courts are holding virtual conferences. And we've been able to sort of file cases against tenants for non-payment of rent, but right now the courts haven't scheduled those yet, and there's a sort of an indefinite suspension with that. So, like I said, it's about what's going on and what's not going on. So right now, we also, on existing warrants for the people who had a warrant of eviction against them for non-payment of rent prior to the pandemic, the court has set up a special part to hear applications to evict those tenants, but that's a recent development, and the court is starting to schedule those hearings. So it's an ever-changing, fluid situation.
And when you say that, do you expect it to continue being ever fluid and changing? Do you find that what you say today may not be the same in a month?
Well, there's a lot of pushes by tenant groups to sort of cancel rent and cancel mortgage payments, which thankfully has not gotten a lot of traction, because I think as much as housing advocates push for that, I think the cooler heads understand the economics of the city and the state and how long-term damage that would cause the state, the government. But they're continue to push for more stringent relief. But the problem is that there's not really any relief out there for landlords as of yet. There's no fund for them to sort of, dip into to say, oh, I need to, pay the oil bill because heat season's coming, or I need to do, necessary repairs to the building. So this is really the predicament landlords are in, unfortunately, right now.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring in Andrew Dansker now on that specific issue, because Jeff has been talking about landlords not getting any protection. And one of the issues with the landlord is that they're not getting rental income, but they still have to pay their mortgage. So Andrew, how has lending in general been impacted? Are terms different? Are banks still willing to lend? How's it going on that front?
Yeah, Mike, that's a great question. And I think that, the issue that lenders are facing is exactly what Jeff is describing, right? The income from the building is uncertain, and it isn't guaranteed in the way it was before. You can't take people to court in the same way. You can't take action on a personal guarantee on a commercial lease in the same way. Everyone knows a lot of stores are closed, not operational, semi-operational. And the lenders are justifiably and understandably concerned. What that's led to, generally speaking, is a rollback in terms of lending a little bit. The beginning of quarantine, say March and April, the banks completely shut down to wait and see what would happen. Things have opened up again in the fall and late summer, but they're still more conservative than they were. Loan-to-value ratios are a little tighter. All banks are asking for collections reports, which was never something that was requested before. Almost every loan being done in New York City right now has an interest reserve attached to it. That's a novel feature which did not exist in January, February of this year. So there have been a lot of changes.
Andrew, can you explain interest reserve, just to give an understanding?
Sure, absolutely. Many banks are setting aside an account at the outset of a mortgage that contains 6 to 12 months worth of interest for the loan. The exact contents of the account and the way in which the money is released depends on the lender, differs from lender to lender. So to give you an idea, some of them are paying the mortgage right out of the gate from that account. Some are requiring it to be held separately and have the borrower continue to pay current on their mortgage despite having that account set aside. Some of them are putting aside interest only. Some of them are putting aside interest and principal. Some of them have it being released on back to the borrower, if assuming it's being held and not used, released back to the borrower on performance. Some have a more nebulous test associated with COVID and resumption of normalcy. The basic result is that the banks are putting on belt and suspenders.
Okay. So, we've talked about what is happening in New York, and both, feel free, either one of you. We know what's going on in New York. We know the regulation that's affected all types of real estate in New York. Do either one of you see capital? I mean, this might be a question more for Andrew, but do you see capital flowing out of New York? You hear stories about it, and certainly I have clients that have that as well. But do you have clients that were only New York based before, now suddenly are interested in buying a different asset type in a different area of the country, and why?
There's two questions embedded in what you said. You said is capital flowing out of the city, and then you also said, are people suddenly changing that we're focused on the city to focus outside the city? I find a lot of my clients keep a foot in multiple worlds, and it's a question of shifting focus. And there definitely is a shift of focus outside the city. I think, you can see across the board a decline in transaction volume in the city. In a normal year, 75% of my work is in 5 boroughs. This year, 75% of my work is not in the 5 boroughs. And that has been Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Colorado, California, Michigan, Ohio, running the gamut, really.
And I think that really started even before COVID with the passage of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which was passed in June of 2019, which really hurt investment in the city because it took away a lot of the upsides that landlords were, and incentives for landlords to basically, reinvest in the buildings and also to get to increase the values of these buildings, right? So what they did was they basically limited the amount of individual apartment improvements and major capital improvements that a landlord could do to a building. They limited rent increases even on vacancies just arbitrarily, so that really started, the HSTPA was sort of the precursor to what's happening now. And I think what COVID did was sort of accelerate the downside of the passage of that law, right? Which basically brought all of those negative things to the forefront a lot quicker than it normally would have, because it accelerated, what I think was going to happen over a large period of time into about a 6 or 8 month period at this point. So, that's really the first salvo, and unfortunately, COVID probably has now made it even harder for, maybe even a longer term solution to that HSTPA problem, because now we've got to deal with sort of what's immediate here, which is getting people to go back to living in New York City and go back to investing and opening businesses in New York City. One of the things also that the COVID has done with the court, being not being operational as it should be, is that when people are nuisances in their building, when there's lease violations, you don't have that enforcement mechanism to sort of alleviate that problem, as quickly as it should be. Landlord tenant cases are summary proceedings, which was designed specifically to get a quick and expeditious relief to a landlord tenant problem. And before, the HSTPA sort of made it a much longer process. They extended deadlines, they extended the court's discretion in adjourning and putting over matters for longer periods of time. And now that the court is not as operational as it could be and should be, this is only exacerbating the problem and exacerbating the sort of exodus of New York City that my clients every day are telling me, you don't understand how much, I've got 80 vacancies right now, and I've never had more than 5 or 10 at any one time. Especially in September or October when the busy rental season just happened, and usually they're pretty much at capacity at this stage of the year. So that's really what sort of was the precursor to all this, I think.
There was I call the Tenant Protection Act the law of unintended consequences, because you have landlords right now who want to keep their tenants, and they want to lower to the preferential rent. But one of the issues with that law was that if you lower rent to a preferential rent for an existing tenant, all the future increases are based off the preferential rent. So you have landlords who want to work with tenants, but they can't because of that law. And I remember earlier on in the process, I think in April, May, during the height of the pandemic, when the rate was astronomical, it took a lot of effort, a lot of legwork, a lot of advocacy to allow the landlords to temporarily decrease rent stabilized units to a preferential rent to house first responders. I remember I was dealing with a property in Elmhurst, right next to Elmhurst Hospital, which is one of the epicenters for COVID patients. And it took a lot of time, which is something that should not have been that complicated. It shouldn't have been so complicated to say, like, you want to house a first responder, do it, and in 2 months, you're not going to be penalized for it.
Right. The HSTPA also, increased the look back period on overcharges and things of that nature, which, now clients come to me with due diligence is even more important than it ever was. And that's also sort of chilled trading, because you may, now, sellers in some instances have to lower their prices on their building during the contractual process because, we don't know if this apartment really was rent stabilized, deregulated, or, we don't have all of the IAI, backup that was done 25 years ago and stuff like that. So again, the law of unintended consequences, rears its ugly head again.
I was just actually going to ask, thanks, Jeff. I was going to ask Andrew about that in terms of how banks are looking at values in New York, because, at any given time, I have 4 or 5 contracts that are being retraded, existing signed contracts that cannot close because the buyer's saying, I'll give up my deposit if you don't lower the price. So Andrew, what are you seeing in terms of what are banks looking at in terms of values? And obviously rents are down, but are values as well?
It's a good question, and I think part of the issue that we're facing in New York is that right now it's a really difficult question to answer. One of the issues is that there's very little transaction volume going on, so it's hard to see a comp for any particular asset that fits the exact profile, and that's recent. I mean, Jeff used the word accelerated before in terms of discussing the impact of the changes that have been rippling through New York for the last year. I mean, between the Tenant Protection Act and COVID and quarantine and it depends on whether or not you read the Post, whether or not you think there's a crime surge happening. All of these things coming together in the space of 12 months, it's hard to understand. And with a volume drop off of 80% in the sales market, it's hard to understand where the values are. The banks are relying on appraisers. Appraisers are doing the best that they can. I think that there's a general sense that values are down a little bit, but much like the stock market that's doing extremely well right now, even though earnings are off, I think people conceptualize New York City real estate as something that will be back. And I don't think that most people view it as something that is on a downward slope that's permanent. So really the value of a building is a function of a multiple of future earnings, right? So if there's a temporary interruption, which I think this is still being viewed as, it doesn't really affect the value tremendously, but for the cost of holding through the disruption, right? And I think you're seeing the same thing in the stock market.
What would you say is, if you could pick one thing that is missing from New York that had existed prior to March 21st or whenever the lockdown started, that needs to come back in order for us to see real change and a real upswing in the market, what would that be? Either one of you.
People.
Yeah. How do you get people though?
And people have to feel safe, and I think that's a function of the procedures that we all follow in terms of wearing masks and the other things like that. And I think, the ultimate safety will be either a vaccine or a treatment or a cure that's proven effective. And those are things that people need. I mean, to ask people to undertake something that they feel is risky and risks their health and their life and their safety, it's a difficult thing to ask. And the reality is the virus is no different than it was in March. Our treatment methodologies are more or less the same, slightly improved through experience, but there's a reason that office occupancy levels in Manhattan are at 10–15%. That's not leasing levels, that's human body occupancy levels. People are voting with their feet.
Yeah, no, I think it's, everything to me, everything relies on public transportation. If you feel safe on public transportation, that changed a lot of the dynamic in the city. The problem is that it's very much a chicken and egg issue, because as people feel more comfortable getting on the trains become more populated and dense, and then people might feel less safe being on the train. So there has to be that medium where people are going to feel comfortable getting the train in large enough numbers to make the city run. Switching back to Jeff, I wanted Jeff, a lot of people are talking about the so-called Safe Harbor Act, and I wanted Jeff to kind of explain that a little bit and go into that for people when they hear that term. What exactly does that mean?
Okay, so it was passed over the summer, and I sort of alluded to it before, where, typically when you sue a tenant for rent and they don't pay, your relief in court and pursuant to the law is that you get what's called a possessory judgment, meaning if they owed you $1,000 and you prove to the court that they owed you $1,000, then you would get a possessory judgment, meaning if they didn't pay you that $1,000, your remedy on top of a money judgment against them would be your ability to evict them. Okay, the legislature finds that having evictions would be a public health problem, so that they basically took away that portion of the relief, which would be enabling you to evict that tenant for that $1,000. Now, the initial ideation of this law was that it applied to rent that accrued from March 7th through some date in the future where restrictions from the pandemic were going to be lifted. I think just in the last few days, Governor Cuomo issued Executive Order 202.66, which did two things. It extended that sunset provision to January 1st of 2021. But what it also did, which is more importantly, is that if you had owed that $1,000 prior to the pandemic and you had a warrant of eviction against you, you now have a defense to say, I shouldn't be evicted before January 1st of 2021 because I had a financial hardship due to the pandemic. So it is a defense that can be raised, that has to be raised in court and proven to the judge. So the court, in response or maybe even in anticipation of this flood of motions by the landlords to try to get these apartments back or get paid, they've set up a special part to hear these motions. Now, the sort of catch-22 here is that, in the past, there was always this narrative that landlords, all they want is to evict every tenant under the sun because somehow they are, that is what landlords are supposed to do. Now, I can tell you that most of my clients right now, they just want to get paid. And especially in light of what we talked about with the HSTPA, and that there's not much upside in necessarily, unless, generally in getting tenants out, unless there are other certain circumstances that you can do with an apartment. They're not looking for that vacancy. They're looking to get paid. And mostly the cases I'm starting against people who are ghosting their landlord, right? Who aren't responding. So that's really what we're finding. Most landlords want to make deals, and the narrative, if you're reading narratives that landlords are just, looking to throw every single tenant out on the streets of New York City, it's a false narrative. That's all I can say.
How often have you heard the term heads in beds? All the time.
Right.
You keep the tenants you have, and that goes, listen, that goes for residential, goes for office and retail too. It doesn't make any sense to lose a tenant where you don't know where the next one's coming from. I mean, I would, obviously in the office retail, the changes. I mean, I just to speak to the renegotiation of leases. I mean, on behalf of commercial tenants, we've been able to negotiate 6 months of free rent, and a longer build out, and income generated rent, where until the tenant is making money in the space, turning an actual profit. They have to, obviously there are barometers on how to prove that, but until they turn an actual profit, they don't have to pay rent. On the landlord side, this is what we've negotiated as well. It's just a situation where you want to keep the tenant in place. You want to keep it at all costs. It doesn't make any sense to have a non-paying tenant just to keep a tenant in place. But there's certainly something to be said for not having a vacant space in the lower level. I mean, Jeff would certainly knows a lot of our co-op and condo board clients, especially the co-ops, the walk-up co-ops. I mean, they generate a lot of their operating revenue from that ground floor space. And when that ground floor space is empty, especially a restaurant, and that affects the building. I mean, that affects co-op and condo buying into a co-op or condo in the city. So, these are things that cannot be resolved. So Jeff, simple question. How do you get the tenant to pay the rent? All these protections, all these changes in the law, how do you get them to pay?
Well, communication is very key. I think, having it, trying to work out deals with your tenants to, and look, everyone has a different business model. Every single landlord has different financial considerations. Some of them are willing to wait out the tenants and say, you know what, I don't want, I'll wait through the process, and, because they can afford to. And some of them need that cash in hand, and they're more apt to make a deal. A lot of tenants, read the headlines, read the clippings, and, speak to advocates, and they take it upon themselves to decide that they don't want to pay the rent, even though they can. The federal government was giving a stimulus of what, $1,200, a week to people who are on unemployment. And, there are some people that was more than what they were making, when they were working, So with that being said, there was really no excuse for them to not pay the rent, So to get them to pay the rent is, I think, you have to have an open line of communication. And if that breaks down, you have to be ready to take legal action, because when the courts, really open, I think they're going to be dealing with this on a sort of a first come, first serve basis. And you want to have your case in that hopper. You don't want to start, you don't want to be at the back of that line, So, and also it gives the tenant an idea that, a sense that, you're serious. It doesn't mean you're a bad landlord. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that this is business. We all have to survive, and trying to get something is better than settling for nothing.
I agree. I think a big misconception for a lot of landlords is that starting the process of litigation is this doomsday scenario, and it's not. And I've heard from clients, well, I have a great relationship with my tenant, I don't want to do this. Like, that has nothing to do with it. It's more that you're protecting your rights, which is perfectly fine. And very often, even when I'm in a contract and there's a time of the essence provision or something where, claiming that they might be in breach, you call the other attorney, or at least, I call the other attorney and say, this is what I'm about to send you. So you maintain the line of communication and keep things moving forward towards potential resolution, even if you're protecting your rights. You can do both things. Somehow lawyers walk and chew gum. Things can get done. It does happen. So I'm going to prediction time, guys. 2021. Let's say, okay, today is what, October 7th, I believe? Something like close? October 7th, 2021. Where are we? And pick whatever part of this hellscape we're in right now. October 7th, 2021. Tell me where we are. Either one of you.
I guess I'll jump in and say that I think that October 2021, we have started to normalize. I think that effective treatments are in the works and are being distributed, and that's allowing people, which are the main ingredient in the equation, to return to what we would describe as something normal. And I think that that's the key to restoring the balance. I think that even in 2021, this time next year, we're still going to have a lot of stuff to work through in the pipeline. If you look at the 2008 financial crisis, the nadir in asset pricing was in late 2009 and into 2010. So I think that the crisis that's being created right now will still be working itself out at this time next year, but I think we'll be on the path to recovery, even if the trend line on asset values might be moving in the opposite direction.
I think a year from now, the biggest thing that will affect what is going to happen in the future is the mayoral election. Okay, who is going to be the next mayor after Mayor de Blasio, and what is their platform, and how does it affect real estate? Because, that's, a lot of people say, once de Blasio took over, he was not really a friend to the real estate industry, and frankly allowed, a lot of sort of quality of life situations in the city to sort of go back to where they were, 20, 30 years ago, when the city wasn't as desirable a place to live. So I think the biggest thing, because hopefully, God willing, the COVID situation will be in a better place, with a vaccine or therapeutics or what have you. But I think the biggest thing that's going to affect the next, let's say, 5 years is going to be who the next mayor and sort of the local state of, the local state officials who are elected, and how they shape the recovery from this. That's really what I think is going to be the biggest sort of wild card in predicting what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting because when Jeff, you're talking about that's not a political party situation, because by and large, anybody who's run New York well in the past understands the importance of real estate and finance to the city. And we've seen that on both sides in terms of people who understand how real estate makes city go, how finance makes city go, and when it's negatively affected, it's not just real estate. I think that's a common, I don't want to say misconception. I think more like people are ignorant of it. The fact that how much is affected by hitting real estate owners, because they are the people that bring people into the city. People come into offices, people live, people go out to restaurants and bars, and all of that is affected. But just to add my own prediction, I do agree with a lot of what Andrew was saying in terms of I'm hoping if there's no vaccine, if we're not back to some type of normal in a year from now, I mean, you're talking about, I don't even know what we're talking about in a year from now if we're not on the road back. I don't think there's any belief, and Jeff mentioned as well. I don't think there's any chance we'll be back to where we were before this in a year. I don't, maybe not even 2 years. So, but I will say that we have to have a situation. I think somebody has the mic on. But I will say that we will be back on the road to normalcy. You'd have to believe we have a vaccine, a workable vaccine. The majority of the population has been cured, and New York is still doing their job. I mean, listen, we as a city and as a state have done, frankly, a hell of a job getting back to where we were. Even where we are right now, where we were compared to April, is somewhat of a miracle. And I'm heartened by the fact that I do both resident. The townhouse sales, high-end condo, that's still very big. Homes, whether they're for primary or secondary residences in the city, gives me belief that people think this is so before we wrap up, I just want to ask one final question, and feel free to expand coming in. And when I say perfect, noting full well that majority of clients are people who are buying rental. Who would be that kind of person who you could be able to get it done?
Jeff, I don't know about you, but I think I'm going to have trouble answering this question.
Yeah, you sort of cut out, Mike. Sorry.
Mike, one more time. What was your wrap-up question?
I'm sorry, I lost you, Andrew.
What was your question? You cut out.
No? Okay.
So I guess to make New York City function, in addition to people, we're going to need broadband internet service.
That's actually a true statement. You know, there's,
If you,
you know, with the court system, they want to go more virtual. And one of the problems is that a lot of people who get sued for rent can afford a lawyer or don't have a lawyer, but they also don't have internet service or high-speed internet service in their apartments. So the court is actually actively working through trying to solve that problem to give people access to justice. So
Yeah, which is the same issue they're seeing in the schools, right? About
Right.
remote learning. Yeah.
if you can hear me, but if not, wrap up without me. But I want to and go on.
All right.
well, thank you everybody for attending, and take care.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Mike. Take care.